Very good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the MCBS Modern Chronicle series with one more exciting session. Thank you for sparing up time to join us with this virtual platform. I am Dr. Manish Yadav, the Program Coordinator for Aviation and Airport Management and Domain Faculty for Aviation with Modern College of Business and Sciences. This particular Chronicle session has been being broadcasted from our main campus in Bushehr, situated in Muscat, Oman. Just to brief about the MCBS College, it was being formed in 1996, and within a span of 24 years, we have pioneered ourselves not only in the education for the general education, foundation, computer science, general management, but also in the industry domain oriented programs like aviation and airport management, commercial law, health and safety, logistic and transport management in tune with the 2040 vision of Sultanate. Today's the topic of Chronicle is very genuine, very timely, and the intense. The talk is on high reliability organization, how the HRO defines aviation to bring together safety culture and business continuity. And to present this talk, we have with us Dr. R.N. Glassman. Just to quick a profile for Dr. R.N. Glassman. He is presently working with Associate Professor of Management and IT Strategies in College of Business at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University at Worldwide Campus. Dr. Glassman is the Chair of Management and Technology Department, and previously he served as the Program Chair of the Master of Science in the Management Program. Dr. Glassman has a Doctorate of Management with focus on Management and IT Strategies from University of Maryland, a Master's in Aeronautical Science with dual specialization in Aeronautics and Human Factors from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. Dr. Glassman has diverse set of applied interest, including the management, organization behavior, IT strategies, analytics, enterprise architecture, teaching and technology, and application of such in general aviation, also in terms of aviation industry, including the high reliability organizations. He is a very ambitious and a very well-known researcher, and his work has been published in numerous national and international journals, including the Compensation and Benefit Review, issue in Information Journal, Journal of International Business Education, International Journal of Aviation, Aeronautics and Aerospace, Air and Space Power, Journal of Business and Horizons. In addition, Dr. Glassman served on the editorial board for the Enterprise Architecture Body of Knowledge. Dr. Glassman is a thorough aviation enthusiast who founded a regional aviation training academy and leveraged the technology to deliver the rich web-based content to the aspiring pilots. In addition, he is the Federal Aviation Administration FAA Safety Team Representative, Gold Seal Flight Instructor, Single Multiple Instrumental, and also the Pro Bono Business Consultant to Women and the Minority-Owned Business. He also served on multiple workforce development and technology board as both as a chairman and an advisor. Dr. Glassman has consulted for multiple airlines as well as served as an expert witness in numerous aviation-related legal matters. On behalf of MCBS, we welcome Dr. R.N. Glassman to this wonderful elite virtual platform. Audience, if you do have any question and answer within the session, please don't forget to just write it down into Q&A tab. Over to you, Professor R.N. Glassman.
Oh, thank you very much for the warm welcome. Let me begin my slide share. All right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all those that have tuned in. I wanted to start by thanking you, Dr. Manish. It's an honor to be here, and I'm proud of the great work that I've seen at the Modern College of Business and Science. It's very intriguing, and the growth is impressive. Today, I bring you a webinar on the High Reliability Organization, and it's involving aviation and beyond. And what I mean by beyond is that the High Reliability Organization has its roots in aviation contexts, but it's grown outside of that dramatically into other contexts. So I want to begin by, I guess, asking a very vague question, which is, what do these organizations have in common? And you'll see at the top left, you'll see a military organization, the bottom left, a healthcare organization, and in the middle, aviation and aerospace. You'll see an aircraft, an air traffic control tower, and an airport. And at the top right, a nuclear reactor focused on nuclear energy. And that doesn't necessarily apply to nuclear energy. It can be any type of energy or power grid. What these organizations all have in common is that they are extremely complex. They are in complex environments, engaged in complex work with a high error consequence and a very, very low error rate. It could be said that across any of these organizations, any type of error could result in death, mishap, or any kind of grave injury to the population, which is why these organizations must be highly reliable. One of the things that's interesting about just this spread is if you could imagine the growth, there's 6 pictures here. If I actually added all of the organizations now classified as highly reliable, the slide would be overfilled and there'd be too many photographs for us to consider. One of the things that's interesting is that we've always focused on aviation. That's my background, those are my roots, that's where I work. But the High Reliability Organization, we receive more telephone calls from our local hospital asking how they can elevate to the same status of high reliability as, for example, an airline or an airport or an aircraft. So the concept of becoming high reliability is growing, and it's growing quickly. So what does it mean to be high reliability? One of the things that I think is fascinating is if you look at the bottom left, we have your local restaurants. And if you look at the XY axis of this, we have risk, and then we have reliability. Reliability being the lowest failure rate possible, and risk involving some form of danger and or consequence. If I were to go out to my local restaurants and find that they were closed or unable to serve food, that wouldn't be a very big deal. And of course, right now in our national circumstance with a global pandemic, that's a pretty common experience, at least where I am. The next is the automobile. The automobile, we all want to purchase a reliable automobile. Nobody wants an unreliable automobile. However, if it were to break and something were to happen, the risk and or danger and consequence isn't that great. You pull to the side of the road, you either fix the problem or you call for help. However, the High Reliability Organization is labeled such because the reliability and the failure rate must be so low because the risk and or the dangers and consequences are so high that to not do that is to risk life and limb. And being high reliability, I want to clear up a misnomer. It's more than just doing a good job. It's about repeated, predictable outcomes in high-risk, complex environments. And that's a key function, repeated, predictable outcomes. Every time we land an aircraft, the passenger shouldn't wonder if it's going to be okay. So let's add the word organization for a moment. So what does it mean to be a high reliability organization? And an organization is a grouping of things and people and cultures and togetherness that function under a single mission, vision, and values. So the original research on the high reliability organization shows a couple of common characteristics. The first is tight coupling between systems. So everything has to work together harmoniously. If any one part of a system does not work together harmoniously, the system fails and we have an incident or an accident. So for example, if the navigation excuse me, system doesn't work, the autopilot won't engage, and vice versa aboard an aircraft. This also includes things like baggage handling. For example, if we don't effectively route baggage within the airport underground, connected flights are missed. Passengers are delayed, passengers are rebooked, the jetways get busy, new incoming aircraft have no place to park. So these tight couplings are a characteristic of the high reliability organization, because if any one component fails, the system fails. Next, it's having simultaneous critical outcomes. And simultaneous is a key word because things are all happening at the same time. If you could envision your luggage traveling underneath the airport at the same time that you're walking through the airport from terminal to terminal, jetway to jetway, there have to be simultaneous critical outcomes for things to function correctly. And that can be also illustrated as landing safely at the correct airport, because landing safely at the incorrect airport in and of itself has consequences from runway length to accidents to incidents, etc. The third facet is an extremely compressed timeline. As you can imagine, aircraft fly quickly. Air traffic moves around the skies quickly and it moves around the ground quickly. So the compressed timeline is a facet of the high reliability organization because that time compression means that actions and activities must be very strategic and on point. Because if they aren't, even if they're the correct actions, but they're too slow, we don't get the correct outcomes. Therefore, we're no longer highly reliable. Another facet of the high reliability organization is having multiple decision makers. Within any aviation construct, for example, the flight deck, we have the pilot in command who's in charge of the aircraft, air traffic control who is directing the aircraft, the airline who is providing standard operating procedures. So even though it seems like at any given moment there is a single decision point or decision maker, there really aren't. It takes roughly a half a dozen people to simply push an aircraft back from a gate or a jetway. So there's always multiple decision makers in a high reliability organization that have to be able to communicate amongst themselves very quickly, especially under time compression. There's also the idea of high accountability. The role of pilot, of airport manager, of air traffic controller, these are what I refer to as final say roles. What they say goes. And that high accountability is extremely important because without the accountability aspect, then we have diffused responsibility across the organization and decisions and actions cannot be made quickly or in a timely fashion to where safety isn't affected or reliability isn't affected. The next and second to last factor is a short decisional feedback loop. This means that when you take an action, the reaction comes quite quickly. So for example, when you issue a takeoff clearance from air traffic control to an aircraft, that aircraft is in the air within about 90 seconds. So you have about 90 seconds to identify that you've made an error and or retract the takeoff clearance, or for the crew to recognize a safety hazard, because the action is already complete within about 90 seconds. So again, we're starting to paint the picture of an organization that's fast moving, that has high degrees of accountability, multiple decision makers, and all the systems interrelate very, very closely. The final thing is a little bit of a different factor, but it has to do with error visibility. Anytime we break something in aviation, the public knows immediately. It often makes the news, it's written about, we have to report it to multiple agencies for safety oversight reasons. It becomes a high visibility error. And in the aviation and airline space, the last thing we need are things like passenger fear. So even though something to us might not be a big deal, such as turbulence, etc., we really don't want to scare people away from flying or from the aviation environment. Now, if you take every word that I just said that was in aviation and you replaced it with an operating room, or you replaced it with starting up or shutting down a power grid, or operating a piece of military hardware, all those same rules apply. So this conceptually is growing, and it's because a high reliability organization is hyper vulnerable, in essence, to accidents, to incidents, etc. And that vulnerability is something we have to overcome. Anytime we zing an airplane down the runway and up into the sky, or back down to the ground. And it's impressive that we, as an aviation culture and aviation system, have done such a good job of addressing those vulnerabilities to put forth a safer environment. I want to share just a quick example of how this didn't work at a major airline hub here in the United States. There's a device called a kicker. And a kicker, just like the name in football implies, looks like a boot, and it kicks the luggage down the correct conveyor belt under the airport. So it reads an RFID bag tag, it queries a database, the database replies, and then the database reply tells the kicker where to kick the luggage to the proper conveyor belt. If we miss, so if the information doesn't come back, then the piece of luggage has to go around the entire system again, be reread by the RFID bag tag, and then be re-kicked in the right direction. Each one is an error. Every time the kicker doesn't kick, or it kicks in the wrong direction, that piece of luggage does not go to the passenger or the plane. So it has to be manually sorted. Imagine if you had to manually sort 10 or 15 or 20% of all the luggage going through a major metropolitan airport. The solution was interesting. We stood there and we literally stared at it. And we looked at it and we looked at it and we looked at it. And what we realized is the database query time needed about an additional 10 to 20 milliseconds. So we're talking the blinks of an eye, because the baggage is moving at 20, 22 miles an hour at high speed, 10 to 12 miles an hour at low speed. And what was interesting is we had two choices. We either could change the computing power necessary to give us 10 additional milliseconds, or we could separate the reader for the RFID bag tag from the kicker by an additional 3 feet. That additional 3 feet allowed the 10 milliseconds of query time to take place. And then all of a sudden, our error rate went from 2 digits, 10, 11, 12% of manual sort, down to 2% of manual sort. So those types of insights and actions are what we need from today and tomorrow's aviation experts, because we have to hands-on investigate and ask ourselves, what does it mean to be high reliability? And we can't accept failure, and most importantly, we can't accept consequences of failure, or else we're in deep trouble. So I want to talk a little bit more about failure and some of the organizational characteristics that make up the high reliability organization. First and foremost, we showcase success. You'll see the glossy brochures and all the great information we put forward about the great work we do in the aviation space. We should showcase our successes to the flying public. We should also showcase our failures internally. If we don't showcase our failures, or we have a fear of showcasing our failures, then we really become avoidant, to where we can't solve a problem that we can't shine the light on and address. So that's an interesting cultural shift, where we want to hide mistakes, we want to hide errors, we want to kind of sweep them under the rug. In an HRO, it's the exact opposite. We want to talk about error, we want to engage error, we want to ask ourselves about failure at a very regular basis. Next is a quest for operational excellence and reliability. What does it mean to be reliable? And what does it mean to be more reliable? We have to benchmark those differences. And from those benchmarks, we have to move forward to tackle continuous improvement. And I'll talk a little bit more later about continuous improvement. Third, we have to understand what to avoid and what triggers bad events. So most of us understand intuitively that stalling an airplane with a lot of passengers aboard is a bad idea. So we know that that is a bad event, and then we know what triggers that bad event, exceeding the critical angle of attack of the airframe, or the airfoil, should I say. So we invent complex procedures to avoid triggering bad events. We have a stick shaker, we have a stick pusher, we have enunciations, we have alarms. So we intentionally identify the bad things and we build controls to avoid the bad things. But the first step in that is identifying the bad things. And that is why we have to focus on failure. Somebody somewhere had to understand that stalling an airplane was bad and that it puts the passengers' lives at risk, from which to then put in an effective control from which we can avoid that. Now we have to formalize roles. All organizations have formalized roles, whether it's levels of executive leadership, management, the folks doing the work, etc. But in times of crisis, or emergencies, or abnormal conditions, a high reliability organization breaks rank. We don't just go to our superiors looking for the solutions. We go to anybody with the proper knowledge to find solutions. And whether that comes from the ramp, whether that comes from baggage handling, whether that comes from any facet of the aerospace experience, it makes no difference. As a pilot, I've had to ask flight attendants what's going on under certain circumstances, and their eyes and their ears in the aircraft have been very informative to me. And even though my role as the pilot flying the aircraft is to manage certain circumstances, I have to know when to ask others for help and when to look to expertise, whether the expertise is formalized or informalized, from which to solve problems quickly. And you'll see that when we talk about things like aircraft evacuation. You can leverage a passenger from which to assist with an aircraft evacuation. They're not in a formalized chain, but you can train them quickly enough and you can leverage their informal expertise as a human being to assist in an emergency. We also see strong safety and reliability cultures. And these are things that are embedded in the mission, the vision, and the values of the airline, the airport, the aviation business. And finally, errors are going to occur. We can't completely avoid errors. It's, well, impossible. So we have to be resilient when errors occur and make sure that we have multiple layers of continuation. So if an error occurs, we can continue to move forward without a substantial consequence. And you'll hear me talk a little bit more. The FAA and other aviation organizations have waged war on error. And I think that's actually a mistake. I think what we should, in essence, be against is not so much error, but consequence. So we make errors all the time, but if it has no consequence, then the error itself wasn't necessarily punitive. It didn't cause us a problem. So it's interesting when we start to shift our thinking, which is what becoming a high reliability organization is. It's a shift of thinking to where we start focusing on failure and we start focusing on consequence. And then we reverse into what errors are important to tackle or to put controls in to address, avoid, or remedy. So we've talked about what makes an organization high reliability. We've talked about some of the tenets of a high reliability organization, but I want to spend a moment talking about how do you get there? Because young organizations will ask me a very simple question. I know what it means to be high reliability, but how do I become high reliability? And the first answer is actually almost a silly answer. It's you need an error catalog, a risk catalog, a vulnerability catalog, a threats catalog. And you need to document all of these things and understand what your risk footprint really is. Because if you don't understand that, then it's really even hard to dialogue about risk if you can't identify risk. The first, architecturally, is a safety management system, or SMS. These are very formalized tools that focus on the management of safety, the training of safety, the policy and the governance aspects of safety. And a safety management system also becomes a repository for errors, vulnerabilities, threats, failures, controls for failures, how to build policy by cataloging a knowledge base or knowledge repository of common problems, common issues, common things that the organization or its staff experience. And again, we have to have that open culture because people have to be very comfortable reporting error or raising their hand and say, I made a mistake and the mistake had a consequence. And I'd like to talk about that because I want to learn from that so others don't make the same mistake that I did. If you have the culture in the organization that sweeps the mistake under the rug or hides the mistake or doesn't want to talk about the mistake, you can't become high reliability because that means you can't catalog the error profile of the organization. Next, we have the concept of human factors engineering. And human factors engineering is really a psychology and or physiology. Some would argue its roots are in medicine, which is true, and sociology as well. But it's how humans interface with a whole list of stuff. Technology, computers, signs and signals such as airport markings. The markings on the pavement are human factors engineering products. Even a stoplight to control traffic. The color coding built into the stoplight. A stoplight was designed both with placement coding, such as red, yellow, and green, and it's also designed with color coding in addition to placement coding. Because if you're color blind or color deficient, in most countries you can still drive an automobile and you can tell which light is illuminated, even if you can't tell the color of the light that's illuminated. And even in some countries, pilots can fly who are mildly color deficient, some even color blind, under what the United States calls a statement of demonstrated ability, or a SOTA. And if you have a statement of demonstrated ability and you show that you can fly the aircraft, you can still obtain a license to fly with a color deficiency. That's because the entire architecture of aviation was built around human factors engineering concepts to allow different variables, whether they're optimal or suboptimal. And as an example of that, even if I'm not color deficient, if I'm flying an instrument landing system into an airport that's shrouded in fog, the lighting patterns, the lighting architecture, the lighting colors, the lighting flash rates, all of that was very intentionally designed by human factors engineers. So when we look at errors and mistakes, there's often an engineering component that accompanies those mistakes. And it can also be tied back to human factors. Even in a completely automated system, it was still designed by human beings. The third, and a very interesting concept, is mindfulness. Now, in aviation, you'll hear the term situational awareness, and that is the very aviation-esque term used by most airports, pilots, controllers, etc., is situational awareness. But that actually has roots in the concept of mindness, or mindfulness, I should say, and that is creating the culture of awareness to error and to empower people, regardless of where you are in the organization, to call out the error and to identify all the things that led up to the error from which to make corrections without it becoming personal. Now, there are times in an organizational setting where there is negligence, and you have to take human resources actions to address negligence. You can't have somebody just doing their job poorly. But we have to be wise enough and mindful enough to investigate appropriately to see if it's somebody who's simply doing their job poorly or if the job itself was poorly designed. And that is the intersection of the safety management system that catalogs all of this, the human factors engineers who understand this, and training people on mindfulness and situational awareness so they can drive forward solutions. Now, the final thing encompasses the top three, which is a robust communication channel. How does information flow quickly and easily to decision makers? When I go into an organization and we talk about error, one of the most common things that I hear is, had I only known. And it fascinates me because when I interview people, the data was there, the information was there. Just it was siloed inside of a few people who didn't know how to share it or didn't feel comfortable sharing it. And those are things you have to overcome organizationally, which is why it takes strategic hiring. You have to hire the right people with the right mindset to truly achieve high reliability, and then embed those people in the organization so they can be mindful, look around, and address both error and consequence. So what are some of the tools of the high reliability organization? We've talked about kind of what it is, and then we've talked about how to become a high reliability organization, but these are some very granular tools. First and foremost, software solutions. The landscape is awash with different vendors willing to sell different software solutions, from user experience checks to data collection platforms to automation analysis. We're building software solutions into just about everything, to the extent that we're generating so much data, it probably could be argued that we'll never analyze all of the data that we're currently generating. It's almost impossible. So the downside of software solutions is we want to make sure they're strategic, because you can overburden somebody with multiple software platforms. And that's why SMS platforms are usually holistic solutions. Hardware solutions are great as well. Sensor technologies are one way to build in hardware that allows you to avoid error. For example, when you're coupling a tow bar to the nose of a 737, you could use sensor technology to ensure you don't hit the aircraft or damage the aircraft, and to help guide the tow bar towards the nose gear and ensure they don't collide in a way that causes damage. So if you were to identify through your risk analysis that we're damaging a lot of aircraft and we're damaging them in a very particular way, a hardware solution might be precisely what is needed. Next, we have policy and governance solutions. And aviation is famous for the standard operating procedure. The manuals to be controllers or ramp agents, et cetera, are a foot thick. I've always argued that nobody's going to consume a manual that is a foot thick. You have to get to the point. But in aviation, we like policy and governance. That's just our ethos. It's who we are. So we need to make sure that we write policy that is effective, that is succinct, and that is usable by those who need to use it. One of the things that I find interesting is when I look through policy documents doing audits, is they're unusable. It's authored by an engineer who writes a 326-step process, which really could have been a 10-step process. But typical to the engineer, they diagram every possible action, every possible risk, every possible error, and every possible solution. But that's not consumable. So policy and governance needs to be trainable from a training and development perspective, or we're going to send people home with a giant manual they're never going to read. We then build in redundancy solutions, and those are cross checks and monitors. We check the landing gear on a commercial aircraft usually 3 times before landing. And that's the reason why you rarely, if ever, hear of an aircraft landing without the wheels down. So it's because of that redundancy solution. And redundancy solutions are great. If you watch an aircraft push back from a ramp, there's 3 to 4 people at a minimum who are standing guard around that aircraft to make sure it doesn't collide with anything. And finally, it's risk assessment. One of the neat components of a safety management system is how it generates risk assessment solutions using quantitative risk analysis. We can put data in, we can weight the data and talk about what is or isn't important in the data. We can look at what predicts failure or error in the data, and then we can generate a risk profile quantitatively. So for example, we know that when visibility drops below 3 miles at certain airports based on how they're architected, that we have an increased instance of aircraft colliding on the ground with one another during the pushback phase because of how the jetways are back to back. So therefore, if we had a risk board, and we built one, and it says, hey, today's risk profile is high, medium, or low. Today's risk profile is high because low visibility and tight ramp couplings and lots of aircraft at jetways. So that generates a risk score, and that risk score can be used to educate people to increase their guard or vigilance. And that's an impressive part about being high reliability, is that people obviously can't remain on guard all the time. So if you can control when they elevate their awareness and when they don't, you can often ward off risk. Now, speaking of ground handling, this is an interesting case. So you look at this, and the first thing that comes to mind is, how on earth can a sane person drive a minibus into a jet engine? And that's a very reasonable thought. However, this error chain or accident chain, you'll hear me use the phrase error chain and accident chain because it's never one thing. You'll notice that this vehicle is also missing a tire. And this error began in the maintenance shop. And the maintenance shop was changing a tire. The person changing the tire, the lunch bell rang, everybody got up to go to lunch, and the lug nuts were not tightened. Because the lug nuts were not tightened, when this individual was driving the vehicle, the wheel came off. Unfortunately, when the wheel came off, it caused the vehicle to hit the jet engine, to which then damaged both the vehicle and the jet engine and slightly injured the driver, but not severely. When you look at the accident chain, our tendency is to jump to conclusions and say, what kind of fool could drive this way? But that's not what happened at all. And that's why we have to be focused on root cause analysis. And root cause analysis is what makes us high reliability. We get to the root cause of whatever it is that generated an adverse outcome. And then we tackle that root cause through either software, hardware, policy, governance, etc. Because we're moving into the era of big data, most of us are already there, but we're still generating more and more data all the time. We have to classify error, because now we're going to use artificial intelligence and machine learning from which to predict error. Now, again, you'll hear me use the word error, error classifications, etc. The reality is, it's the consequence that drives the importance of mitigating the error. Low consequence activities generally don't require expensive solutions. High consequence activities do require that degree of resource. So in error patterns, there are random errors. They just happen, and there's no particular pattern that can be computed. There are systemic errors. Here we have a discernible pattern, and we can focus a resolution or antidote on those particular errors. Sporadic errors are interesting because they're not very frequent and they happen without warning. So there was no real intervention possibility. So if you look at this photograph, the driver was engaged in a sporadic error. This was infrequent and without warning, because I wouldn't drive a minibus if the tires often fell off. That wouldn't be a very good way to be. From the maintenance perspective, when you go back into the shop, it was actually a systemic error, because when you put the data into the safety management system, it becomes clear that a lot of the errors take place before or after lunch. And that's because people are not completing their tasks. And when the tasks aren't completed, They're not remembering to pick up where they left off. So you have to look at the chain of events in the error chain or the accident chain and classify them differently without just saying in big picture, this was just an error. Now, and errors are also classified as omissions, commissions, or substitutions. An omission is you didn't do something. In this example, this was an error of omission. We failed to tighten the lug nuts on the tire, which caused a bunch of problems later. An error of commission is doing the wrong thing. An error of substitution is seeing a problem, but engaging with the wrong response action as a result of observing a problem, pushing the wrong button, so to speak. Two final classifications are the level of consequence. If it can be undone, it's a reversible error. If it cannot be undone, it's an irreversible error. In the 1980s, we lost 6 or 7 large commercial aircraft for the same reason, improper takeoff configuration. So the pilot would apply full throttle and the flaps were not set appropriately. That greatly lengthens the takeoff run of the aircraft, and the aircraft would run off the end of the runway and crash, generally killing all aboard. And those are irreversible errors because in the takeoff run, there was no solution. So you couldn't just deploy the flaps, although I'm sure it happened sometimes if there was time. So because it was an irreversible error, we needed a technology solution. And the technology solution was to put micro switches in the throttle quadrants that then link to the flap position indicator, to where on takeoff, if the flap position indicator wasn't 10 degrees or 12 degrees or whatever it was for that airplane, it would sound a takeoff configuration alarm and in essence warn the flight crew that they're about to engage in an irreversible error, which allows them to retard the throttles, reconfigure the aircraft, and then continue the takeoff safely. So we need to have controls in place, especially when the errors are irreversible. And this is just a diagram of what random versus systemic error can look like. And the importance of this diagram is when we move into machine learning and artificial intelligence, we can start doing cluster analyses on the data that comes out of the safety management system. And that cluster analyses tells us where to focus resources, because resources are finite. You can't solve every problem, and problems come with a cost to solve. So we have to make sure that we're deploying solutions into either irreversible error patterns, places where we can't go back if we make a mistake, where there's high likelihood of loss of life or limb, or there's financial hardship, or there's operational hardship. So if we break a jetway while nobody got hurt, we can't utilize that jetway for continued operation. There's an operational hardship. One of the neat things about machine learning and AI, which we're doing a lot of now, if this were a different talk, we'd talk algorithms, but nonetheless, is that we can classify error, predict error, and pattern error. And the predictive component is the most interesting because now we can think about errors that were really inconceivable before the algorithm pointed us in that direction and said we should look over here, even though we haven't had a catastrophe. There's enough activity in this segment of the organization to warrant us doing that error catalog or that failure catalog to prevent that catastrophic event. Because one of the things, for example, in surgery or in the military or in aviation for that matter, it only takes one catastrophic event and it changes the entire face of the airline, the airport, etc. So that to me is a very critical component of the conversation. So we're in a new era of aviation analytics and risk management. We just built a center of excellence around aviation analytics and risk management, which was a lot of fun to do because we're surrounded by data. As an example, an Airbus A380 has about 25,000 sensors aboard the aircraft, and each sensor is generating a data stream. On one single flight of about 2.5 to 3 hours, a 787 generates about 500 gigabytes of data per flight. And that data is being streamed down to the ground for analysis, both in real time and ex post facto later. So it's pretty interesting to view the data streams. one of the key components is we have to architect for analytics, build systems that give you data streams that you need to solve problems, to optimize, to plan, to save money, to prevent error, etc. And what's interesting is we're doing work now, especially with a global pandemic, in disruption management and fleet planning and crew planning and revenue modeling. And we're also doing some great work in predictive failure modeling, but that's not as important in a global pandemic because we're not really flying as much right now. So it's still important, but nonetheless, we're doing a bit less of it. But it's still an emerging field. We still see data sets that airlines and airports and manufacturers and parts manufacturers are sitting on that they're not analyzing. And from my perspective, that's a shame because there's a lot of richness in the data that the AI or ML algorithms can pull out. So here are just some fun photographs, with a what happened question mark when we talk about error classification. The majority of these errors were human factors related errors. The only one error on this screen that was not human factors related is probably the one that looks the scariest from a passenger perspective, and that's the JetBlue aircraft in the top center. That was a parts failure when the landing gear were deployed. They did not rotate 90 degrees to align with the direction of travel, generating a lot of sparks when the tire came off and the rim wore down, wore the rim down about 40% of its total diameter. But nonetheless, the other accidents were completely preventable. Delta Airlines was doing a maintenance check and they did a high power run up, which they didn't, in essence, plan to do. And they didn't clear the area from around the intakes of the aircraft jet engines. And of course, that's what happens when you do a high power run up. The aircraft in the middle in red, again, was a maintenance related issue. The crew had parked it at the maintenance hangar and the aircraft was not chocked yet. Somebody said they were going to come back and do it. And they set the parking brake, which is a hydraulic lock on this aircraft. And the maintenance crew bled down the hydraulic system for maintenance, which released the parking brake because there's no hydraulic lock anymore. And the aircraft was not chocked. The aircraft was left unattended for about 40 minutes. A thunderstorm came through the airport and literally blew the airplane down a hill and into the road. Cowling coming off, that was just an improper maintenance activity. And the 747, which I believe was totaled at the bottom left, was interesting. They were moving that from a maintenance hangar to the jetway to pick up passengers, but they in essence started the wrong two engines to taxi. They started engines 1 and 4, but the hydraulic system for braking is on engines 2 and 3 on the inboards, not the outboards. So in essence, instead of doing a proper brake check, instead of noticing on the different enunciations that there's low hydraulic pressure or no hydraulic pressure, they just taxied the aircraft, and then when they needed to make a turn or stop, they were simply unable to turn or stop. So it obviously did substantial damage. My recollection is the aircraft was totaled. These are all errors. Some are reversible, some are consequential. Obviously, some are more frightening to passengers. All of these should not have happened except for the JetBlue, because that was a sporadic failure, it was unpredictable, and then the crew did a great job from that point forward. But all of these were predictable and should have never happened within the true tenets of a high reliability organization. So this is a gorgeous photograph. I want to talk about operational excellence in business. And this is a bit of a pivot, so to speak, from high reliability organizations in just the aviation sector to a broader viewpoint, because HRO concepts are highly sought after by businesses in general. The data center market, I've been approached by several data centers because in the data center world, we need defense in depth, RAID systems for remote backups. We need cloud computing architecture that allows us to transact 99-something% of the time from an uptime perspective. But we need to do the what if analysis, so to speak. What if we have a hurricane, a typhoon? What if we have a fire? What if we have civil unrest? How are we going to safeguard these data warehouses and data architectures? So the concept of high reliability really does spread far beyond aviation. In general business, oddly enough, they're high innovation businesses. So we tend to view aviation as very conservative. We don't just go innovate. And that's because we don't just put new technologies on an airplane just to test them, because passengers are aboard and passengers probably don't want to feel like they're being on a test case or a test flight. So we tend to view the aerospace industry as low innovation. That is the furthest thing from the truth. That is completely false. It's actually a high innovation industry, but it safeguards the translation of the innovation to the normal operation more so than, say, a technology firm or a software company. A software company can, in essence, deploy a change, realize that it breaks your computers, and then push an update to fix your computers all in the course of the same day. So consequence was minimal, it's high tech, it's leading edge. So I don't ever want you to think that aviation is not high innovation. It's just high safeguard of innovation translation to normal operations. Now, process excellence in and of itself is a domain focusing on process. How do we processize things to where we have workflows for everything? We understand normal procedure, we understand abnormal procedure. And then we have a solid strategy to address those normal and abnormal procedures. That requires engaged leadership and involved stakeholders and employees. You have to rally everybody around the high reliability organization concept. You can't have an organization that's overly vertical with a lot of layers of management and more management and more management and then leadership and then senior vice presidents, presidents. That's not bad, but it's just a lot of siloing of different organizational layers. So the best way to engage people and involve people is to either A, remove some of the organizational layers and flatten the organizational chart, or B, to ensure robust communications across organizational layers, because most organizational failures are communications related, which is we had the information, but we failed to share it. So that's why it's important to have those involved stakeholders. And stakeholders are outside of the organization as well. So for example, we utilize industry advisory boards, we utilize focus groups, we utilize different marketing aspects. Any parcel of information can be brought into the organization from which to make decisions. And that is certainly not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength in leveraging all of your assets. Second to last is customer focus. We want an organization to where our customers are not only number one, they're our number one priority in the architecture of the organization. It's very easy to tell frontline staff, make the customer number one. It's almost cliche at this point. However, if you architect an organization, and certain airlines and airports and outfits do it better than others, to where the customer always feels first, now we start to move to operational excellence. We can't build the customer in last. And most importantly, we have to be committed to excellence. So when we're doing things, we have to have a continuous improvement plan. We have to be moving forward. We have to be consistently analyzing, and we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be excellent? Where are we today? And how do we get to where we want to be tomorrow and in the future? And that requires that solid strategy, that third bullet point. Because for this to work, you have to embed it from an HRO perspective into the entire organization. You can't just say, well, this portion of the organization's high reliability, but this other portion isn't. It just doesn't work because people move throughout the organization, processes are codependent, and as we talked about earlier, there are tight couplings throughout the organization. So let's talk about continuous improvement for a moment. When you look at the risk 2x2, where you have frequency and then you have consequence, most passengers would view this photograph as high consequence but extremely low frequency. Nobody boarded this aircraft thinking that the left engine or engine one would catch on fire on short final and then upon landing, that would result in an aircraft evacuation. Airport rescue and firefighting did their job. They were on standby and they were about 45 to 50 seconds in trail of this aircraft. One of the crew members of this aircraft actually I went to college with. So we've had some fun talks about this situation. But one of the things that's fascinating is changing the organizational culture to ask tough questions. We tend to avoid tough questions, which I find fascinating, because the tougher the question, the more provocative the thought. The more provocative the thought, the more opportunity to innovate and solve. If we only ask easy questions, well, we get easy answers. So one of the tough questions is, where do we make the most mistakes? And it's a legitimate question we have to ask ourselves. But many organizations don't. They're either afraid of the answer or they're waiting to get to a better place before they really start to shine the light on the mistakes that they make. So then the next question is, are we actively, and actively is the key word, are we actively taking steps to understand and reduce error? Most organizations that I've seen that are not successful as high reliability do so passively. They passively take steps to understand and reduce error only after the error takes place. If you actively do it, you can preemptively address error. So are we encouraging people to report errors? And that goes back to the culture of reporting. And these other two questions are interesting. What is the biggest, most likely threat? And what is the biggest, least likely threat? Most organizations fail to ask about the least likely threat. However, aerospace does it better. As an example, the least likely threat on the day of this flight was the left engine catching on fire. That was the least likely threat. However, there was a checklist for it. There was a response for it, both at the level of the airport, the air traffic controllers, the flight crew, the flight attendants, even the passengers had a response for this. It could be said that we generally do a good job of asking questions such as the least likely threat, because obviously an engine on fire is quite a big threat to the success and health of that aircraft. Now, the training and development component should be the discussion we've had today in giant lights. If we don't train and develop people into the HRO umbrella, then people can't come alongside you and actually do the work of the HRO. Most importantly, we have to teach mindfulness and situational awareness and empowered communication. If we don't do that, we won't get the error reporting that we're looking for. All employees should have an understanding of human factors principles, such as the I'm safe checklist before you do anything: illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, and emotion. Am I under the influence of any of those things? And encourage the what if thinking. So you have to ask, what if? I sincerely doubt the captain of this flight woke up that morning and said, what if my left engine catches fire today? I doubt that happened. I actually asked that question and the answer was no. But what's most interesting about this is, in the what if thinking space, the engineers asked that question. What if my left engine catches fire? What do I do? Then the standard operating procedure teams asked that question. They created a process for it. So even the what if question needs to be broad and colossal. Nothing is off limits. We, even at Embry-Riddle, didn't think we would lose almost every airplane to a freak tornado. It literally cut across the flight line at Embry-Riddle in Daytona Beach, Florida, and we lost almost every airplane, about 100 or so. And that obviously had a huge impact to operations, but nobody thought for a moment that with the number of thunderstorms in Florida, they're so regular and routine, what if we had a freak tornado? Didn't think of it. Now we have all kinds of conversations around what to do if we think a tornado is coming. And finally, this is the last slide. HROs are always ready. That is the key. And you're always ready because this is the litmus test. If you're thinking about it for the first time when it happens, it's too late. That is the litmus test. When something happens for the first time and you haven't already thought of it, you've already made the mistake from a high reliability perspective. So high reliability organizations are famous for their degrees of planning. Hospitals can accommodate power failures. Hospitals can accommodate viruses that spread or things that are communicable that walk in the door. Everything has a policy or a procedure. If we have a discrete event, fire, tornado, attack, etc., the business continuity plan is what enables us to transact during the event itself. So for example, and we've had this happen where we've had a fire in a control tower, we can shift that function elsewhere. And we can do so almost at the press of a button. So within 20 or 30 seconds, all aircraft in a particular sector are talking to a completely different person in a completely different location, sometimes 500 or 1,000 kilometers away. The next thing is emergency preparedness and action planning. That is a subset of the business continuity plan. How do we manage the event itself? What is the firefighting action in the example of the control tower? What is the evacuation action, etc.? How do we actually take the immediate action steps that save life and limb, minimize damage, and allow us to recover and remain resilient? And that resiliency piece can't be underscored to the extent that resilience is the final outcome of a high reliability organization. Things will still happen, but we must be resilient to bounce back from those things, learn from them, and try to put some controls in place going forward. And that's what the disaster recovery plan is. So the business continuity plan is the big architectural plan that allows us to keep transacting and moving forward, such as diverting aircraft, etc., and reassigning airport operations. The emergency preparedness plan is while the airplanes are still in the air. The disaster recovery plan is how do we get back to normal operations after the discrete event and bring us backwards to that pre-disaster status. In other words, how do we return to normal? So this is a high reliability organization. It's an HRO, and it's focused on failure, but it showcases successes. And it does so by always being ready, by being resilient, and by being in tune with the people that provide data. And that data is the mission critical step to be able to ward off error, most importantly, mitigate consequence, classify error as reversible or irreversible, analyze long-term data sets and trends, and in other words, build a better organization. So that is my talk today. I greatly thank you. My email address is here at the end for anybody that wants to reach out or has questions. I know we have a questions and answers session coming up, but I'm always interested in research collaborations, best practices, partnerships, or anything that we can do together to build a better aerospace community. All right, over to you, Dr. Manish.
Thank you, Professor Arden, for such a wonderful info-laden and very, very astonishing session over it. I'm sure that, it was very, very intense, engaging, and it was surprised to know that each and every stakeholder, we have put it on the desk, and then, this it touched every part, be it with the aviation psychology, be it with the data analytics, be it with the airline operations, or we talked about the operational excellence and safety management system. So it is literally covering up the each and every aspect in terms of, the operational aspect, especially for the aviation industry where, this right now to catch up this operational excellence and to performance standard is one of the bigger kind of a challenges. I'm sure that the audience are, of course, my inbox is full of loaded with the questions. With your permissions, can we start our question and answer session, sir?
Oh, my pleasure.
Right. Sir, one of the participants asked that what aspect of high reliability organizing would we like to institutionalize?
Institutionalize in the context of the aerospace industry. I think what we don't have yet are closed loop systems where the actions generate data, the data inform the actions. And that closed loop allows us to, in essence, address error, identify error in the loop, because within the action, data collection, reaction paradigm, which hopefully we'll get to, where everything generates that amount of data to analyze, errors will become more obvious, especially the errors that are less obvious right now, that are hard to detect, and that with machine learning and artificial intelligence, they can become detectable.
Thank you, sir. And next question is relevant with the safety. Does the high reliability organization ensure safety, or you would be explaining into some other aspect?
I don't know that we can ever ensure safety due to the complexity of our environment. We are always going to be vulnerable by virtue of the fact we are aircraft traveling at high speed off the ground, hundreds of thousands of parts working together hand in hand to safely fly. And then from an airport perspective, a weather perspective, there are probably too many variables from which we could ever ensure safety. But for example, if I were to purchase space at a data center that says we have a 99.92% uptime statistic, I would be quite comfortable. I can't ensure safety or ensure uptime, but I would drive a degree of comfort that means that I would never second guess my safety. And right now we're there. Passengers don't generally second guess their safety aboard an aircraft, but we still have a long way to go because of how visible our mistakes are.
Yes, true. And I think that the domain or the range of operations is so intense because there are multi kind of stakeholders and their objectives is also overlapping with regard to the safety concern is there. One question is in each and every aviator's mind. So how we will revive back in this pandemic? Or what do you think that what could be the best response from airport and airlines to ensure the passenger safety and of course to bring back the confidence to travel again?
Wow, if I had that answer, I think I would bottle it up and sell it. No, it's a fair question. And I think that is one of the unfortunate parts of who we are as an aerospace industry. We have a tendency to want to control what it is that we do. We as flight crew always want to be in control of the aircraft. We want to be in control of air traffic control and passenger safety. We want to be in control of the airport environment. And one of the things that weather has done is weather is one of the few things that's not within our control, but we have protocols from which to circumnavigate it. The global pandemic is something that we lack the protocol for, and we don't have the ability to control it. And the lack of control, I think, is as unsettling as any other portion of the situation. I heard somebody remark, I'd rather be hit by a hurricane because then it goes away and then I begin rebuilding. I know how to rebuild, I know how to start over, and I know how to keep moving forward. But even that we can't answer right now. So what I think I would like to see happen is a phased approach back to the skies. I think we need to incentivize air travel. I think we need to de-risk it. I think if you believe a lot of the literature on human behavior and human psychology, we need to de-risk it not in the sense of there's actual risk, but in the sense that there is perceived risk. Because the global pandemic, it isn't necessarily about aviation. You have multiple points in the equation. The first is the city pair. What is the pandemic doing in the city I'm departing? What is the pandemic doing in the city to which I'm arriving? The airplane is simply bringing you between those two city pairs. It is just a vessel from point A to point B. So I think there needs to be a larger conversation on the actual safety and address the perceived safety as we slowly begin to restore air travel. because for those to which air travel is not a requirement, but optional, we'll call them tourists, travelers, etc., if there is any threat to their perceived safety, they're ready and willing to no longer travel because it's not a job requirement. It's not, a destination of certain importance. So I think for us to restore passenger confidence, we need to start controlling the message better. And I think there needs to be a global consortium on how to control that message so it's uniform. So that way, one country or set of countries isn't sending one message about flight safety, and another country or set of countries is sending a different message about flight safety, because the difference in the message in and of itself becomes perceptually suspicious to a passenger, and the lack of continuity in that message, I think, is really what troubles many.
Thank you, Dr. Hahn. And I think that you are on the very, very precise, very intense point for getting it on that a collaborative approach is must, and that has to be standardized. That is, that's the key point up. One of the audience question is relevant with the volunteers reporting. So how difficult do you think to maintain the justices for volunteer reporters, and how difficult is to promote volunteer reporting for airlines, especially in this pandemic?
That's a great question. Currently, there's different levels of voluntary reporting. So, for example, in the United States, the FAA has the Aviation Safety Reporting System, ASRS. And what it is it's a system to where if you disclose, for example, a near midair collision or an error in protocol, an error in procedure, or when your airline might have pressured you to fly when you thought you shouldn't have flown, it serves as a no consequence report. It's anonymized. Your name and information is removed from the report, and your name and information is returned to you. You literally get a letter back in the mail where somebody took a pair of scissors and cut your information off the top of the document before processing it. The only reason your information is there is in case they have additional questions or they need additional insight or detail. So having an anonymous portal from which to collect error data is the first start in building trust. And once you build trust over time to where there isn't a punitive action, then that trust allows you to do non-anonymous reporting. The other interesting tactic that I've seen at several other airlines is committee-based reporting, where it's your peers that you report to, similar to a union environment, but not directly. You report to your peers, who your peers determine if your action was negligent and something you should be retrained on, or it was something you're simply trying to report as a legitimate accidental error. And by having your peers as the collection point, there's less fear between the power and authority between your employer and the employee.
Thank you, Dr. Aaron. That was, one of the very establishing kind of a concept in terms of the volunteer reporting. So when it comes to the government regulatory role, so what do you think that in establishing, be it airline or be it an airport, what is the role of government or a regulator for establishing this particular aviation entity as in high reliability organization?
I think there's a strong need, and there are different ways to architect a response to that need. The first is organizational excellence and defining it and recognizing it. Because even though I've used the term high reliability organization multiple times, that was the basis of our entire conversation, it really can be elevated one level higher to operational and organizational excellence. And government plays a strong role in ensuring organizations are socially responsible, they behave in an ethical way, that they architect ways for organizations to become excellent and define organizational excellence. And there are government and non-government agencies that attempt to define organizational excellence inside and outside the aviation space. But I think there is a strong need, especially globally, because remember, these are the same aircraft, regardless of what country operates them. They're the same crew conceptually flying the same aircraft, regardless of what airline, country, or whatever operates them. So therefore, it should to some extent be a globalized standard on how that functions in a way that's both highly reliable and safe.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Arun. And one personal question from my side. This particular concept, how you develop your interest into this particular domain as far
So
as the HRO is concerned?
it was accidental. And it's funny how it happened. So my father was also a professor at a university here, and we lived in a community adjacent a hospital. So some of the doctors and staff from the hospital lived in the communities that I grew up in. And what was fascinating was when I was a student at Embry-Riddle, been a while, I'll leave the date to your imagination, but what was fascinating was at the time, healthcare had not adopted crew resource management procedures and the high reliability concept. And there were numerous medical errors where a patient would go in to have a certain finger removed for cancer reasons, and they would remove the wrong finger. So we started to realize that there was a need for crew resource management concepts. And if you look in the healthcare literature, you'll hear concepts like a checklist: right patient, right procedure, right place, right protocol. And it's a checklist that the surgeon will go down. I'm verifying that this is person X. Yes, that is the correct patient. There's an X on the limb to be removed. Yes, I see the X. That's the left arm. So they started to operate like a flight deck. And then it was, what concepts connect organizations that have similar behavior traits to one another? And the answer was the high reliability organization, because now that healthcare has started to embrace some of the aerospace concepts, the same thing with power distance in surgical suites. It used to be that nurses never felt comfortable speaking up if the doctor was about to make a mistake, because the doctor was above the nurse in the authority paradigm. But the nurses have great visibility and insight into what's going on, and empowering them to speak up has saved a lot of people's lives. So the high reliability organization encompasses multiple domains and disciplines all around the same constructs.
Oh, wonderful to know it up, Dr. Arun. Thank you very much, Dr. Arun, for this wonderful insight and for having up the queries, for educating it up on this wonderful initiative, very intense and timely topic. Thank you very much, Dr. Arun, for joining us on this virtual platform. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. It's been a great honor.
A pleasure. Meanwhile, thank you to the audience for sparing up the time. Thank you to our IT and database team for this flawless coordination. A special thanks to Dr. Said Kitani for the coordination. A special thanks to Mrs. Said Nasser, the Director of Marketing and IT team. Also, kudos to my colleagues from the IT and database team, Mr. Ahmed, Mr. Abdul Kavi. Join us for the next upcoming very informative sessions, exciting sessions. For any other information, tune in to our college website. Thank you. Thank you very much.